Thank you, Kaylee. Super exciting stuff coming up. Going to be welcoming on shortly Jack Daleo, staff writer, Flying Magazine, joining us from Chicago. And we kind of have a big event going on here. I like to think if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to see it, does it make a sound? If a drone flies beyond visual range and there's no one there to observe it, did it indeed fly at all, Jack?
Thomas, I can't tell you because I wasn't there to see it, but according to Zipline, that's a drone delivery firm that recently pulled this off. Yes, it did indeed fly. So Zipline, for those who are not familiar, that's a drone delivery company. They're based in the San Francisco Bay Area. They're focused mainly on medical logistics. They deliver things like prescriptions, vaccines, blood samples, mostly in Africa, but they also have services in Arkansas, North Carolina, and Utah. They've made over 815,000 deliveries. For context, the next closest company is Wing. That's the drone delivery arm of Google's parent, Alphabet, with about 350,000 deliveries. So we're talking about a pretty big company here. And the news from them is that earlier this month, they flew a drone beyond the visual line of sight, or BV loss is the term, of the operator, without people watching it from the ground. And that's the first time that that's happened in the U.S.
So, Jack, it's great to talk to you as always. I love chatting about this kind of stuff. And this is a really big accomplishment because it requires specific approval from the Federal Aviation Administration and a waiver of that visual line of sight observation requirement. For a lot of these drone companies, that is kind of that like big step into large scale commercialization because, of course, the hardest struggle is, okay, you're very much limited to where you can take your drone if you have to watch it the whole entire time. And Zipline itself called this the holy grail of certifications, right? Because it now gives them the opportunity to really expand towards open commercialization and, more importantly, equitable access. Can you talk a little bit about the waiver process from the FAA and if this kind of sets up the precedent for more companies to, I guess, get this waiver?
Yes, they did call it the Holy Grail, which it might sound dramatic, but this really is a big deal because in drone delivery, like you said, this kind of approval opens up more equitable service, more accessibility. So the way that the regulations work, right now there is no final rule or regulation on those BVLOS drone flights. So right now there's only a handful of companies that can fly under those permissions using waivers from the FAA. And then even with those waivers, the FAA requires visual observers, or VOs, to be stationed on the ground below the route, just to keep an eye on the drone while it flies. It's a safety precaution. Now, Zipline was able to take out those VOs because it was granted an exemption to that rule for its Utah and Arkansas services in September, along with three other firms. UPS Flight Forward, who your FreightWaves audience might be familiar with, is another one of those. And the idea there, according to the FAA, is essentially to open up summary grants, which basically would streamline the pathway to exemptions for other companies until a final BVLOS rule comes out. So essentially, these summary grants they're kind of like copycat waivers for companies that have similar infrastructure, technology, drones to those companies that have already been approved. So the FAA could quickly award exemptions to companies that operate like Zipline, like UPS, or like those other two companies that received approvals. So Zipline was the first firm to fly with these expanded permissions, but it probably won't be the last.
And speaking of ways to get that approval process, one of the things mentioned that they're using is a DAA system, detect and avoid, like a bat's echolocation. Is that one of the ways? Is that a unique thing? Are all these drones going to start pinging like a above ground submarine? Or are there other ways, I'm assuming, that you're going to have to show for safety so you don't hit birds, planes, power lines?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are a few other ways to do it. So that DAA system that you mentioned that works like a bat's echolocation is kind of the key to Zipline's approval. The FAA determined that it provides an equivalent level of safety to those visual observers. But there are other ways to achieve that, like UPS, for example. They're using a ground-based system. So their approval is based on their use of remote operations centers instead of visual observers. But the detect and avoid technology is something that's pretty common across drones. It just, the methods differ between companies. So Zipline's, their DAA is patented. I'm not sure if there's another company that uses acoustics in the way that they do. but detect and avoidance is definitely a big deal.
So, Jack, you mentioned that Zipline mostly operates in the medical delivery space and that medical logistics space. Do they have any plans to expand into maybe parcel delivery, or some of these companies are doing, like Walmart's doing their drone delivery for their small orders, specifically in Arkansas, or are they looking specifically at kind of staying in this lane of medical logistics?
As far as I'm aware, medical is kind of the niche that they have picked out. In their view, it's it's a more it makes more sense economically for them. The medical space, those deliveries, typically they're critical deliveries, they're high priority, they need to move fast. And so the cost to replace, say, an ambulance or ground-based transportation with a drone, it's a bigger deal. So their focus is definitely on medical delivery. They've kind of honed that niche for several years now. They've been flying in Africa since 2016. So I think that's kind of where they would like to stay.
And looking ahead, talked about, I think your article mentioned proposed rulemaking in May. They're collecting this data and information. As we're starting to see more of these waivers being granted, is there going to be a timeline? Is this something where we're going to wait for a final rulemaking coming up soon? Or when should what should our time frame be to expect some kind of concrete rules for folks to adjust to?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've tried to get an answer from the FAA, but at the moment, it's something that they're not able to put a real time frame on. They provide updates every now and then. Basically, the latest one is that they are reviewing a proposal from a committee, an advisory rulemaking committee, it's called, of stakeholders in the drone delivery industry that proposed rules and regulations around BVLOS. So they're reviewing that. They're reviewing comments from stakeholders. It's a long process because the goal here is safety. The reason BVLOS is in place is so that any chance of a crash happening with another aircraft is prevented. So it's a deliberate process, but the hope is to see that in the next year, maybe 2 years or so, a final rule comes out.
Thomas, it's the government, so we know that nobody's going to work very fast. Jack, thank you for joining us this morning with this news. We'd love to hear it, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.